Imagine a battle where mathematics itself signs a death warrant. 500 knights against 26,000 soldiers of the East's finest army. Any general will tell you that this is not a battle. It is mass suicide. But leading this suicide squad is not a mighty warrior, but a 16-year-old boy whose body is rotting alive right beneath his heavy armor. A king who feels no pain because his nerves are dead, hiding his face behind a mask so as not to terrify his own subjects. Why did the great Sultan Saladin, who united the Islamic world, flee in terror from this half-corpse into the desert, abandoning his army and his honor? And how did it happen that what a dying cripple held together for years through sheer will, healthy, wealthy, and arrogant men destroyed in a single day out of stupidity and pride? Watch this video to the end to witness the most expensive mistake in the history of the Middle Ages. You're in for a story of betrayal that makes blood run cold. A wedding under a hail of siege engine stones, and how one wrong step turned a triumph of the spirit into a catastrophe that deprived Christians of the world's most holy site. This is a chronicle of a fall where heroes look like monsters, and monsters decide the fates of empires. 500 knights against 26,000 warriors. Think about that math. That is not a layout for a battle. That is a statistical error. It is a sentence signed by the logic of war itself. If you put those numbers on the table for any general, he would tell you that resistance is not heroism, but insanity. But the history we are about to uncover could not care less about mathematics. It is written not with ink in the silence of monastery libraries, but with pus and blood on the scorching sand of the Holy Land. By the end of the year 1177, the Middle East froze in anticipation of the inevitable. The air here is not just hot, it is heavy, soaked in the smell of horse sweat and fear. On one side of the scale is Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom the world will remember by the name Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, a man who did not just conquer cities, he stitched the Islamic world into a single fist. The greatest strategist of his time, possessing resources that European monarchs could only dream of. His army is a sea of steel and turbans, a disciplined death machine ready to wipe the Kingdom of Jerusalem off the map with one lazy motion. And on the other side? Who stands between this titan and the fall of the Holy City? A boy, a teenager of 16, Baldwin IV, the king who is rotting alive. Have you ever wondered what a person feels when their body becomes their own prison? Forget the romantic ballads about knights in shining armor. Come closer. Look at him. This is not just a disease. This is leprosy, a slow, ruthless killer that takes away your human form piece by piece. First, you lose sensation. The nerve endings die, and pain, that faithful watchdog of the organism, falls silent forever. You could stick your hand in a fire and only realize it when you smell burning meat. The historian William of Tyre, the young prince's tutor, was the first to notice this terrible sign. He described how children from noble families played in the palace, pinching and scratching each other. Everyone screamed in pain. Everyone except Baldwin. He laughed. He looked at his arms, covered in abrasions, and felt nothing. At the moment William realized the reason for that laughter, his heart must have skipped a beat. It was not a gift of resilience. It was the seal of death. Imagine the coronation of this boy. He is only 13 when he ascends the throne. Barons and bishops bow their heads, but what do they see? They do not see a monarch. They see a walking corpse. They see a countdown timer. The entire court of Jerusalem is a jar of spiders, where everyone is waiting for the king to take his last breath so they can tear at their neighbor's throat for a piece of power. No one bet on Baldwin. Doctors whispered that he would not live to 20. Politicians were already dividing his kingdom. To them, he was a convenient screen, a temporary figure, a cripple on the throne. But they were wrong. They were all wrong in their calculations. God took his body, but the devil was afraid to take his spirit. Instead of hiding in the dark chambers of the palace, concealing his disfigured face from the world, Baldwin puts on gloves to hide his sores and climbs into the saddle. Do you understand what that costs? To ride horseback when your hands cannot feel the reins. To control a horse relying only on body balance and knees, while every movement resonates with a dull vibration in decaying joints. This is not just will. It is a challenge to nature itself. His face is hidden. Myths speak of a silver mask. Historians argue about thick bandages, but that is not the point. The point is that beneath those wrappings lay a mind as sharp as Damascus steel. He understood his position perfectly. He knew his time was running out, faster than sand in an hourglass. And it was precisely this knowledge that made him dangerous. A man with nothing to lose knows no fear. Baldwin understood. As long as he breathes, Jerusalem stands. The atmosphere in the kingdom by the year 1177 was poisoned by the expectation of catastrophe. The Templars and Hospitallers sharpened their swords, but doom was readable in their eyes. The barons bickered over lands, not realizing that soon those lands would become their mass grave. And looming over all of this was the shadow of Saladin. The Sultan knew about the king's illness. His spies reported every new spot on Baldwin's skin. To Saladin, this youth was not an opponent, but an annoying hindrance, a mistake of nature that simply needed to be swept out of the way. Arrogance is the favorite sin of the strong. Saladin looked at the maps, saw a tiny Christian army, saw a crippled king, and drew the only logical conclusion: Jerusalem is defenseless. It was pure mathematics. 26,000 against 500. Strength against weakness. Health against rot. The Sultan gathered his banners. A massive army moved out of Egypt, kicking up clouds of dust visible for many miles. It was an avalanche, ready to bury the Christian world beneath it. Saladin was sure the boy king would lock himself behind the thick walls of Jerusalem and pray for a miracle while the Muslims looted and burned the countryside. He was sure that fear would paralyze the cripple's will. And it is at this very moment, when the horizon darkened with enemy hordes, when common sense screamed, "Run!" that Baldwin IV does what no one expected. Not his enemies, nor his friends. He refuses to die quietly. While the king's flesh rotted in Jerusalem, confidence in an easy victory was being forged in Saladin's tents. The Sultan smiled, looking at the scout reports. He saw open gates. He did not know that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Saladin did not just enter the kingdom of Jerusalem. He kicked the door open. The Egyptian army moved not like a military formation, but like a natural disaster. 26,000 men. Imagine that roar. The ground vibrated for miles around, warning of death's approach long before the first banners appeared on the horizon. The Sultan walked past the fortress of Gaza without even looking at it. Why waste time besieging stones when a whole country lies before you, ripe for the harvest? The Templars in Gaza clenched their fists, watching from the walls at the endless stream of enemies, but dared not sally out. It would have been suicide. Saladin knew this. He could smell their fear. It is here, in the intoxicating air of impunity, that the great strategist makes a mistake history does not forgive. Arrogance. It is a poison that acts slowly, but kills surely. The Sultan was convinced. The crippled king had scurried into a hole. Scouts reported that Baldwin IV was in Ascalon. Excellent. Let him sit there. Saladin decided the war was already won. Only the trophies remained to be collected. He issues an order that looks like insanity from the perspective of military science, but seems justified from the perspective of his logic. He allows the army to disperse. Go and take, he seems to say. The disciplined death machine instantly crumbles into thousands of small bands of marauders. They wander through villages like locusts. They are no longer interested in tactics. They are interested in gold, livestock, and slaves. They burn Ranla. They besiege Lydda. Smoke from the fires rises in pillars to the sky, blocking out the sun. Saladin remained with the core of the army, but his limbs, his cavalry, his best units, were busy looting. He lost control of the situation without realizing it. He thought he had God by the beard, but in reality, he had bared his throat to the knife. Meanwhile, in Ascalon, something was happening that does not fit into the mind of a healthy person. Baldwin saw the smoke. He smelled the burning carried by the wind from the scorched villages. His advisors, wise, grey-haired men, begged him to stay. "Your Majesty, the walls of Ascalon are strong. We will wait it out. The Sultan will leave when he is sated." It was a reasonable speech, the logic of survival. But Baldwin looked at them with his festering eyes and saw what they did not. If he stays, the kingdom will die morally. If the king hides while his people are being slaughtered, he is no longer a king. He is just a caretaker at a graveyard. "Get the horse ready." This order sounded like the raving of a madman. The doctors were horrified. Do you understand what it means for a leper to put on chainmail? Baldwin's skin was one continuous open wound. The metal of the armor, even through padding, turned into a grater for his inflamed flesh. Every movement caused suffering we cannot even conceive of, or, even more terrifyingly, caused nothing where the flesh was already dead, and he could rub himself to the bone without even noticing. Servants lifted him into the saddle like a rag doll. His right arm did not work. He could not grip a sword the way a normal warrior does. He could not feel the reins with fingers that had lost sensation. He had to control the war horse with only his knees and the weight of a body that was falling apart. It was a triumph of spirit over biology. It was unnatural. It wasn't an army that marched out of the gates of Ascalon. It was a suicide squad. 500 knights, not 5,000, 500. And a few thousand infantrymen hastily gathered from garrisons, against 26,000 warriors of the East's best army. Any bookie that day would have bet all the gold in the world against them. But Baldwin had a weapon Saladin did not: the psychology of the doomed. And something else. At the head of the column, glittering in gold in the dusty sun, moved the Bishop of Bethlehem. In his hands was a relic at the sight of which knights fell to their knees right in the mud. The life-giving tree, the true cross, the very piece of wood on which, according to tradition, Christ was crucified. Do you understand the stakes? Baldwin went all in. He took the main sanctuary of the Christian world out of the vault and dragged it into the open field. If they lose, the cross goes to the infidels. It would be the end not just of a military campaign, but the end of faith. It was an ultimatum to God. Either you help us, or we lose everything. The small army moved north along the coast. They walked in silence. No songs, no trumpets. Only the creak of saddles, the clang of iron, and the heavy breathing of men walking to the scaffold. Baldwin rode in the center. The heat was unbearable. Under the metal helmet, his head spun. the smell of pus from his own body mixed with the smell of scorching dust. But he did not stop. Saladin did not know about this march. That was the essence of the tragedy unfolding for the Muslims. The Sultan was so sure of the boys' cowardice that he neglected reconnaissance. He thought he was playing chess with a novice and allowed himself to relax, sipping sherbet in his tent while his soldiers stuffed sacks with looted goods. He did not know that the novice had just flipped the board and was rushing at him with a brick in his hand. The gap between reality and Saladin's perception of it was shrinking rapidly. The Egyptian army stretched for many miles. Wagon trains loaded with grain and fabrics slowed the pace. Warriors took off their heavy armor because of the heat. They walked, joking with one another, confident in their complete safety. They were tourists at war. No one expected a strike. After all, between them and the Christians stood the desert, fear, and fortress walls. Baldwin, however, was leading his men not just into battle, he was leading them to intercept. He knew the terrain. Every hill, every ravine, every wadi was familiar to him. He understood he had only one chance, one strike. If they got bogged down in a prolonged fight, they would be crushed by mass. They needed a miracle, or perfect tactical surprise. By noon on November 25th, 1177, the horizon trembled. The Christian vanguard crested the ridge of a hill at a place called Montgisard. Below, in the valley, spread a sea of enemies. Thousands of people, horses, camels, a camp unprepared for defense, warriors bathing horses in the stream, smoke from fires where meat was roasting. Baldwin's knights froze. The sight of such immense force should have paralyzed them. Reason screamed, "Turn around! Run!" 500 against an ocean. King Baldwin ordered himself to be taken down from his horse. He fell face down in the sand before the true cross. Witnesses say he sobbed. But these were not tears of fear. It was the hysteria of tension, a plea bursting from a tormented chest. He prayed loudly, his voice breaking, tears streaming down his disfigured face, washing away the road dust. Seeing the king lying in the dust, the knights felt the cold fear in their veins replaced by something else. Something hot, furious. If this half-corpse is ready to die here, then who are they to cherish their lives? Baldwin rose. He was helped into the saddle. This time, chroniclers say, his gaze was clear. The pain was gone. Only the gold remained. He drew his sword with his left healthy hand, or tied it to his right. Legends vary, but the fact remains, he was ready to kill. Below, in the valley, one of Saladin's Mamluks looked up and saw a glint of sun on a gold crucifix on the hill. And then he saw an avalanche of steel beginning to roll down, gathering speed. While Saladin discussed the route of the further campaign in his tent, the earth beneath his feet began to tremble. But it was not an earthquake. It was the rhythm of the hooves of 500 knights who decided that today was a good day to die. The Jerusalem cross fell upon the crescent moon like a hammer on an anvil. The first scream tore the air. The clock of history stopped. A battle that was impossible by all laws of physics and war had begun. The impact was so powerful that it seemed the earth itself shuddered and cracked. It was not like the start of a normal battle, where two lines of infantry slowly approach under a hail of arrows. No. It was the collision of a freight train with a crowd of onlookers on the tracks. 500 steel-clad horsemen, having reached terminal velocity on the hillside, slammed into the loose, relaxed mass of the Egyptian army. The effect of surprise was absolute, total, paralyzing. Muslim chroniclers would later write that the soldiers of Islam were caught in a state of distraction. That is a very mild phrasing for the hell that opened up in the valley. Imagine, you are feeding your horse, helmet off, or sorting through loot from a nearby village, and suddenly, out of a cloud of dust, a wall of spears flies at you. You have no time to form up. You have no time to find a commander. You have only a split second to realize your death. The front ranks of Saladin's army simply vanished. They were swept away, trampled into the sand, turned into bloody mud under the hooves of war destriers. Frankish knights, these living tanks of the Middle Ages, punched through the enemy formation, leaving swaths of bodies behind them. The screams of the dying were drowned out by the cracking of breaking lances and the wild roar of trumpets. And in the center of this insane vortex was him, the Leper King. Baldwin IV was not just present on the battlefield. He was the tip of the spear. If legends are to be believed, his hands, unable to hold the reins due to the disease, were tied to the pommel of the saddle. The sword was bandaged to his palm. It sounds like madness, but in that moment, it was the only reality. Adrenaline is a powerful drug, capable of temporarily silencing even the decay of the nervous system. The king, who in ordinary times could barely walk from his bed to the window, was now hacking down enemies with the fury of a berserker. He was the embodiment of divine wrath. A living dead man, risen from the grave to take the living with him. His white cloak with the cross, flapping in the wind, became a beacon for the entire Christian host. The knights saw their crippled king in the thick of the fight and lost their minds with rage. If he can do it, so can they. Fear vanished. Only the thirst for blood remained. For Saladin, this was a shock. No, not just that. It was the collapse of his world. The great Sultan, sitting in the center of his huge camp, did not even understand what was happening at first. Noise? A brawl between units? When he was told it was a Frankish attack, he probably laughed. From where? They are locked in Ascalon. But when he stepped out of his tent and saw the golden shine of the true cross cutting through the dust, the laughter stuck in his throat. He saw his elite Mamluks, his guard, his pride, scattering in panic like frightened sheep. The very yellow banners that struck terror into the entire East were falling into the mud. Organized resistance was impossible. The narrow terrain played a cruel joke on the Muslim numerical superiority. 26,000 men were getting in each other's way. The rear ranks pressed on the front, creating a crush in which people died without even seeing the enemy. Saladin's army, this huge, clumsy leviathan, began to devour itself. Baldwin and his knights were breaking through to the center, to the Sultan's yellow tent. They walked over corpses. It was a surgical operation to remove the heart of the enemy army. The distance was shrinking. 100 meters. 50. Saladin saw their faces. He saw the empty, whitish eyes of the king beneath the helmet. In that moment, the great conqueror realized one simple thing. Today, Allah is not looking at him. Today, God is on the side of this rotting boy. The Sultan's escape was shameful. It was not a tactical retreat. It was a rout. Chroniclers are ruthless in the details. The great Saladin, ruler of Egypt and Syria, jumped onto the back of a racing camel, abandoning everything. His tent, his treasury, his slaves, his army. He fled, pursued by a handful of Christian knights, until the night hid him in the desert. As soon as the Sultan vanished, the remnants of his army collapsed. The massacre began. Those who didn't manage to run were destroyed. The baggage train was captured completely. The victors got mountains of gold, weapons, and thousands of prisoners. But the greatest trophy was life itself. By evening, silence hung over the battlefield at Montgisard, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the croaking of vultures already beginning their feast. The heavens opened up. Icy rain began to fall, mixing with blood and sand, turning the field of triumph into a dirty mess. It was a strange, almost mystical finale. Nature seemed to be trying to wash away the traces of what had happened here. Baldwin IV, the hero of the day, savior of Jerusalem, sat in his tent. The adrenaline faded, and the pain returned with redoubled force. Doctors removed his armor, and skin came off with the metal. The bandages were soaked in pus and blood. Victory cost him dearly. Every effort of will accelerated the disease. He won time for his kingdom, but shortened his own. That evening, looking at the captured banners thrown at his feet, he understood something the jubilant barons did not. This is not the end of the war. This is only the beginning of a personal vendetta. Saladin will not forgive such humiliation. The Sultan, fleeing on a camel like a thief, will never forget this day. He will return, and he will be angrier, smarter, and crueler. The victory at Montgisard was a miracle, an anomaly, a statistical outlier. The genius of one man and the stupidity of another coincided at a single point in space and time. But miracles cannot last forever. Dust settled on the golden cross that had once again saved the kingdom. But in the darkness of the desert, a new storm was already brewing. Saladin survived, and as long as he is alive, Jerusalem is doomed to live in the shadow of fear. Baldwin knew this. He felt it with his rotting skin. A battle was won, but the war had only moved to a new, much more terrifying phase. The celebration of victory was laced with the taste of bitterness. The king understood. Now, it was personal. Saladin reached Cairo with only a pathetic handful of bodyguards. They say he did not leave his chambers for a long time. He was silent. He was thinking. The image of the crippled king breaking through to his tent was burned onto his retinas. This boy became his obsession, his nightmare, his Moby Dick. And while psalms of gratitude were sung in Jerusalem, new steel was already beginning to be forged in Damascus and Cairo. Steel tempered with hatred and a thirst for revenge. History took a sharp turn, but the inertia of war is relentless. The cross, which had become a symbol of victory, now became a target. And this target hung around the neck of a dying youth. The silence that fell on the desert after Montgisard was deceptive. It was not peace. It was the sound of a predator retracting its claws to regroup before a new pounce. Saladin returned to Damascus not broken, but changed. Humiliation is a great teacher. If before he saw only a rotting piece of meat on the throne in the King of Jerusalem, now he discerned something far more dangerous. Behind the bandages and mask lay an intellect equal to his own. The Sultan realized, as long as this boy breathes, there will be no easy walk to Jerusalem. The war of swords was over. The war of minds had begun. In the gloomy corridors of the royal palace, time flowed differently. For Baldwin IV, every new day was not a gift, but torture. The disease, as if insulted by his activity at Montgisard, went on the offensive. Leprosy devoured him with redoubled appetite. The king's vision began to fade. First, it was just shadows at the edges of his vision. Then a cloudy veil, turning the world into a set of gray splotches. His limbs finally failed. He could no longer hold a sword, even tied on. He could barely stand. But the paradox was that as the king's body turned into ruins, his strategic thinking became frighteningly clear. He seemed to compensate for physical frailty with incredible mental concentration. Baldwin did not see maps with his eyes. He held them in his head. Every river, every hill, every well. And in this darkness thickening around him, a plan was born, the audacity of which bordered on madness. The king decided not to wait for a new blow. He decided to strike it himself. But not with steel, with stone. Look at a map of the Holy Land from that time. There is a point where the Jordan River becomes shallow, where it can be forded. Jacob's Ford. This is the main artery connecting Saladin's domains, Damascus and the Palestinian coast. It is the throat through which the Sultan's trade and army breathe. Baldwin poked his finger at this point on his mental map and said, "We will build here." It was not just building a fortress, it was a slap in the face. Jacob's Ford was in a zone considered neutral, a buffer, by unspoken agreements. To start construction there meant violating the status quo. It was like starting to build a military base on the lawn in front of a neighbor's house with whom you already have tense relations. In October 1178, work began to boil. It was not ordinary construction, it was a fever. Baldwin arrived personally to oversee the work. Imagine the scene. A blinding, feeble king carried on a litter amidst dust and the roar of hammers, shouting orders in a hoarse voice. He understood it was a race against time. The fortress, named Chastelet, was to become a bone in Saladin's throat. Walls grew with incredible speed. The king threw all resources at it. The Knights of the Temple, the Templars, took on the financing and protection. They understood the king's design. Chastelet allowed for attacks on Damascus, just a day's march away. This was no longer defense. It was an active threat to the Sultan's capital. Baldwin was moving the front line to the enemy's doorstep. Saladin, learning of the construction, was furious. But it was a cold, calculating fury. He understood the danger. If Chastelet were completed, Jerusalem would gain a bridgehead to strike at the very heart of his empire. The Sultan tried to solve the issue with gold. It was a classic move of Eastern diplomacy. He offered Baldwin 60,000 dinars, a colossal sum, just to stop the construction. Baldwin refused. Saladin doubled the bid, 100,000 dinars. With that money, one could hire an army, rebuild cities, buy the loyalty of half the barons of Europe. The king's advisors probably whispered in his ear, "Take the money, sire. We are poor. We need gold." But Baldwin chuckled beneath his mask. He understood that gold is a renewable resource, but strategic advantage is not. The king's refusal was not just a diplomatic gesture, it was a message. I am not for sale, and I am not afraid of you. It was a duel of wills where the stake was not one man's life, but the fate of the entire region. Saladin realized he couldn't make a deal. The leper boy had backed him into a corner. The Sultan, the great unifier of Islam, found himself in a zugzwang situation. Any move he made worsened his position, as long as that accursed fortress stood. By the spring of 1179, Chastelet was almost finished. It was a powerful castle, with a double ring of walls and high towers. It loomed over the crossing like a stone monster, controlling every movement on the road to Damascus. The garrison consisted of select Templars, fanatics of war, the best swordsmen of the Christian world. Baldwin had created the perfect trap. He made Saladin nervous, forced him to react, forced him to make moves he hadn't planned. But this coin had a flip side. Baldwin pulled the tiger's whiskers too hard. The provocation succeeded, but the price for it could be exorbitant. The king squeezed the last juices out of his dying body to raise these walls, but he could not stand on them forever. He returned to Jerusalem, to the darkness of his chambers, leaving the defense of Chastelet to the Templars and luck. And in Damascus, In the silence of war councils, Saladin stopped offering gold. He started gathering iron. He swore he would wipe Chastelet off the face of the earth, even if he had to dismantle it with his bare hands, stone by stone. The insult inflicted by Baldwin's refusal demanded blood. A lot of blood. The air over the Jacob's Ford crossing became thick with tension. The construction dust settled, giving way to an ominous silence. The fortress garrison peered at the horizon, waiting for the inevitable. They knew the Sultan would come. Baldwin had won this round of the intellectual duel. He had built his outpost. But now Saladin had to make his move. And this move implied no chess subtleties, only brute, annihilating force. The chess pieces, carved from bone and stone, were set. The king made his move, bold and dangerous. Now it was the Sultan's turn, and his hand already hovered over the board with a sword, ready to sweep away the pieces along with the players. Baldwin's strategic victory was brilliant, but it also became the catalyst for a bloodbath such as these lands had never seen. Saladin was no longer going to play by the rules. The games were over. The slaughter began. Summer of 1179 turned out so hot that birds fell dead right in mid-flight. But the heat rising from the scorching sand was nothing compared to the heat accumulating in Saladin's heart. The time for diplomacy and bribery was over. The Sultan realized that as long as the fortress of Chastelet stood on the banks of the Jordan, he would not sleep soundly. This unfinished castle was not just a pile of rocks. It was a splinter in his flesh, a constant reminder of the cripple king's audacity. And Saladin struck. It was not a spontaneous raid. It was a surgically precise, punitive operation. The Sultan understood perfectly. To destroy the fortress, one must first behead those who could come to its aid. He waited for the moment. He allowed the Christians to make a mistake. When the army of Jerusalem, weakened and stretched thin, fell into an ambush at the Litani River, the trap snapped shut. King Baldwin barely escaped. He was carried out of the battle on a knight's back, but hundreds of the best warriors were captured. The road to Chastelet was open. On August 24th, a huge Muslim army crashed against the walls of the Jacob's Ford fortress. Imagine the garrison's horror. 700 knights and 1,500 infantrymen, the elite of the Templar order. They looked from the walls and saw not the end of the horizon, but the end of their lives. A sea of enemies. There was no one around to save them. King Baldwin was licking his wounds in Tiberias, gathering the remnants of his troops, but he was too far away. Saladin did not waste men on senseless assaults of high walls. He was an engineer of death. He ordered a mine to be dug. Have you ever heard what inevitability sounds like? For the defenders of Chastelet, it was the dull thud of pickaxes deep underground. The Sultan's sappers dug a tunnel under the main tower, working in shifts day and night. The Templars on the walls heard this sound, felt the vibration through the soles of their boots, but could do nothing. They were trapped in a stone sack under which emptiness was devouring the foundation. The first demolition attempt failed. The tunnel was too narrow and the fire didn't catch. The fortress defenders rejoiced, seeing only a trickle of smoke. They thought God was on their side again. Fools. Saladin merely chuckled and ordered them to dig wider. He personally promised every sapper a gold coin for every wineskin of water brought to put out the fire and start over. 5 days later, the work was finished. The widened tunnel was packed with wood soaked in fat and oil. The flint struck. The explosion and subsequent rumble were heard for dozens of kilometers. The massive wall, the pride of the Templars, on which months of labor and mountains of gold had been spent, simply settled and crumbled as if made of sand. A cloud of dust covered the crossing, and when it cleared, the fury of Islam poured into the breach. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Saladin gave the order, "Take no prisoners," especially Templars. For the Sultan, these warrior monks were not noble opponents, but fanatical killers, unclean ones, who needed to be cauterized with hot iron. Inside the fortress, a massacre began. The Christians fought with the desperation of the doomed. They knew there would be no mercy. Every corridor, every staircase was piled with bodies. Blood flowed into the drains, mixing with the water of the Jordan, turning the river crimson. 800 men were killed in the first hours of the assault. Another 700 were taken prisoner, but their fate was worse than a quick death in battle. Among the captives were the kingdom's best archers and knights of the order. Saladin held a show trial that looked more like a conveyor belt of death. He sat on a dais, watching the process with cold calm. Templars were brought to him. There were no negotiations for ransom, no noble speeches, only the whistle of a sword and the dull thud of a head hitting the ground. The Sultan personally ensured that not a single one of the temple dogs left alive. It was a message to the entire Christian world. The games of nobility are over. You wanted a war of annihilation? You got it. But the most gruesome part wasn't that. Saladin ordered the bodies of the dead, hundreds and hundreds of corpses, to be thrown into the fortress's only well. It was an act of desecration and pragmatism simultaneously. The water was poisoned by corpse venom. The fortress became uninhabitable. Saladin did not intend to leave a garrison in Chastelet. He wanted to wipe this place off the face of the earth. The walls were destroyed to the foundation. The stone that Baldwin had labored so hard to erect was dragged away. When the king's army finally reached the scene, silence met them. Baldwin IV stood on a hill, looking at the smoking ruins. He was late. Only by a few days, but in war, late is a synonym for never. He didn't feel the heat of the fire on his skin. His nerves had long since failed, but he felt something snap inside him. Before him lay not just the ruins of a castle. Before him lay the ruins of his strategy. The elite of his army, the very people who could withstand the enemy onslaught, were rotting in a poisoned well. The Templars, that steel spine of the kingdom, had been slaughtered. The loss of Chastelet was a catastrophe, but the loss of men was a death sentence. Saladin showed that he learns from his mistakes. He no longer underestimated the cripple. He was systematically knocking the support out from under his feet. The king realized, now he was alone. His body was dying, his army was melting away, and his enemy was getting stronger every day. That day, looking at the ashes, Baldwin perhaps felt real fear for the first time. Not for himself. He had long been a dead man on leave. For Jerusalem. He realized he was holding the sky on his shoulders, and those shoulders were starting to crack under the unbearable weight. Saladin left, leaving behind a mountain of skulls and a desert where there had been hope. This was the end of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's military dominance. The initiative passed into Muslim hands. Now the Sultan dictated the terms, and the Christians could only react. The smell of burning from Chastelet spread throughout the Holy Land. Barons in their castles sniffed the air and turned pale. They understood. If Saladin could destroy the most modern fortress and slaughter Christ's fiercest warriors, who would protect them? And in Jerusalem, in the palace, another process of decay began. While the king weakened, vultures started circling the throne. Those who should have rallied in the face of a mortal threat began sharpening knives for each other. The bloody lesson of Jacob's Ford taught them nothing. Betrayal was already ripening in the hearts of the king's inner circle, and it was more terrible than any Saracen saber. The king was blind, but he saw the darkness encroaching on his city more clearly than all the sighted put together. And in that darkness, the eyes of traitors were already gleaming. While fortress walls crumbled under the blows of siege engines, a far more terrible decay was happening in the silence of the Jerusalem palace. Stone can be replaced, walls can be rebuilt, but what do you do when the very soul of the state is rotting? By the beginning of the 1180s, Baldwin IV had turned into a prisoner of his own flesh. The disease, which he had held back for years with iron will, finally breached the defenses. It was no longer the youth who led knights into the attack at Montgisard with a sword tied to his hand. Leprosy took his sight. The world for the king plunged into eternal, murky darkness. His arms and legs, eaten by ulcers, failed completely. He could no longer walk. He was carried. Imagine the smell. Frankincense was constantly smoked, and aromatic herbs burned in the royal chambers, but no incense could drown out the sickly sweet, nauseating stench of a body decomposing alive. Servants changed bandages, trying not to breathe, averting their eyes from what the monarch's face had become. But the most terrible thing was that inside this ruined shell, a sharp, clear mind still lived. Baldwin heard everything. He understood everything. And that was his hell. To be locked in a corpse, watching his life's work being torn to pieces. The court of Jerusalem resembled a jar of spiders into which a piece of meat had been thrown. While Saladin united the East, Christian barons started a war of all against all. They awaited the king's death with the impatience of heirs dividing the skin of a bear that isn't dead yet. Loyalty? Honor? Forget those words. In the corridors of power, only two currencies resonated: ambition and greed. At the center of this snake pit was the king's sister, Princess Sibylla. Beautiful, willful, and, unfortunately for the kingdom, prone to falling in love. She was the key to the throne. Whoever ended up in her bed would get the crown of Jerusalem. And the choice fell on a man who became the curse of the Holy Land. Guy de Lusignan. Remember that name. This is the standard of how a nobody can rise to the top thanks to a handsome face and a lucky marriage. An adventurer arrived from France, a younger son with no prospects at home. He was tall, stately, stupid, and incredibly vain. The exact opposite of the dying king. Baldwin had no body, but he had the spirit of a titan. Guy had the body of an antique god, but the soul of a petty shopkeeper. Baldwin despised him. He saw right through Lusignan, an empty shell in shining armor. But the king was powerless. Sibylla was blinded by love, and the barons saw Guy as a convenient puppet. The wedding took place, and it was not a celebration of love. It was the funeral of the hope for saving the state. Along with Guy, another character stepped onto the stage, whose name causes shudders: Raynald de Châtillon. If Guy was just a fool, Raynald was a psychopath. Former Prince of Antioch, who had spent 15 years in a hole as a prisoner of Muslims, he emerged with a burned-out soul and a singular desire: to kill. For him, treaties and truces did not exist. He was a wolf let into the sheepfold. And this wolf found a common language with the court's new favorite. Baldwin felt power slipping through his rotting fingers. He tried to resist. He tried to appoint his 5-year-old nephew, Sibylla's son from her first marriage, as successor, just to keep the crown from Guy. But what can a blind cripple do against a pack of healthy, greedy predators? His orders were sabotaged. He was ignored. He was isolated in his own chambers, turned into a living symbol brought out to the people only on holidays. The atmosphere in the palace became unbearable. Plots were woven right at the dying man's bedside. When will he finally die? This question was not spoken aloud, but it was readable in the eyes of every courtier coming in with a fake smile to wish the king health. Do you feel the contrast? Outside, beyond the walls, Saladin is methodically preparing an invasion army, training troops, accumulating resources. And inside, in the heart of the Christian world, the elite is busy bickering over titles. This is the classic anatomy of an empire's fall. The enemy doesn't take the fortress by storm until the garrison opens the gates from the inside with their stupidity. In the year 1183, the situation reached a critical point. The king became so ill that he officially appointed Guy de Lusignan as regent. Baldwin handed power to the man he hated, hoping responsibility would make him wiser. It was a tragic mistake. Giving power to Guy was like giving a loaded crossbow to a monkey. The new regent immediately showed his true colors: arrogance, incompetence, disdain for the old generals. The army grumbled. Saladin, learning of the change in power, surely praised Allah. Playing chess with Baldwin was hard. With Guy de Lusignan, one could play giveaway. The kingdom rotted, in sync with its king. Corruption ate away at institutions. Bandits on the roads felt like masters. Taxes were stolen. But the scariest thing, fear disappeared. Saladin stopped fearing Jerusalem. He knew, the lion is dying, and the jackals taking his place only know how to yap. However, in that dark room smelling of death, Baldwin's fading brain still worked. He realized he had made a mistake appointing Guy, and he decided to fix it one last time. Gathering his remaining strength, blind and paralyzed, he begins preparing his final political counterstrike. He will not let this French peacock ruin what he defended with his life. But history does not wait. While the king fought traitors in his own house, black banners appeared on the horizon again. Saladin moved on Kerak, and there, beneath the walls of the ancient fortress, a scene worthy of a mad playwright's pen was about to play out. A wedding under a rain of stones, the cowardice of a healthy knight, and the final, incredible appearance of the Ghost King. Baldwin IV prepared to exit. He knew this would be his final act. God took his body, but left him his rage. And that rage would be enough to stop the Earth's rotation one more time. Just one time. November 1183. The desert around the fortress of Kerak shuddered. It was the most surreal show in the history of the Middle Ages. Imagine a picture worthy of Bosch. Inside a huge stone sack, a lavish wedding is underway. Wine flows, silk rustles, and lutes play, while outside, 100-kilogram boulders launched by Saladin's siege engines smash into the walls. In the castle, they were celebrating the marriage of the young Princess Isabella and Humphrey of Toron. The cream of the aristocracy gathered here to drink and dance, ignoring the fact that their world hung by a thread. It was a feast during a plague. Only instead of disease, the Sultan's army stood outside the walls, thirsting for blood. Saladin, learning of the wedding, showed his famous Eastern cunning, which Europeans mistakenly took for chivalry. He asked in which tower the newlyweds were spending their wedding night, and ordered his artillerymen not to fire at it. Noble? Hardly. It was psychological terror. I know where you sleep. I can kill you at any moment, but I allow you to live as long as it pleases me. He bombed the rest of the castle with methodical cruelty, turning the celebration into a nightmare accompanied by the roar of stones. But the main drama unfolded not in the bridal chamber and not at the catapults. It was happening a few miles away, in the camp of the Christian Relief Army. Guy de Lusignan, that handsome regent, had gathered the largest army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever seen. 1,300 knights, 15,000 infantry, a force capable of crushing Saladin. But Guy did not move. He camped by the springs, afraid to take a step. He was paralyzed. The responsibility that fell on his shoulders proved too heavy for his chicken heart. The barons begged him to attack. They shouted that the garrison of Kerak was perishing, that the kingdom's honor was trampled in the mud. But Guy was silent. He was afraid to lose the army, afraid to lose, and in that fear, he had already lost. Rumors of the regent's cowardice reached Jerusalem faster than the wind. In the dark bedroom of the royal palace, the dying Baldwin IV heard the report. We do not know what his face expressed. It was hidden by a mask and destroyed by disease. But we can imagine his fury. The king, who at 16 led men to death with bandaged hands, learned that a healthy, strong man, to whom he entrusted the throne, had turned coward in the face of the enemy. It was the moment of truth. Baldwin realized, if he doesn't intervene now, Jerusalem will fall not to the strength of Saladin's swords, but to the weakness of Lusignan's spirit. The king ordered the litter to be prepared. The doctors were terrified. Any shaking for him was equivalent to torture on the rack. His body was one continuous open wound. But Baldwin was adamant. He stripped Guy de Lusignan of the regency with a stroke of a pen, or a verbal order, as he could no longer write. He was taking back command. The dead man was returning to do the work of the living. This procession went down in history as one of the most eerie and majestic spectacles of the Crusades era. The army stood in indecision, morale was at zero, and suddenly they saw it. Not a king on a white horse, but a closed box, a litter suspended between two horses to minimize shaking. Inside that box lay a blind, rotting stump of a man. But when the royal standard with the cross was raised over the litter, an electric shock went through the ranks. The king is here. Guy de Lusignan, healthy, in shining armor, suddenly became small and insignificant. He was crushed without saying a word. Baldwin's presence, even invisible behind the curtains of the litter, weighed more than all the muscles of the French adventurer. Soldiers who an hour ago were ready to desert now sobbed and kissed the ground over which the litter was carried. They were an army again, because they had a leader again. Baldwin could not see the battlefield. He could not hold a sword, but he commanded through his aides, listening to sounds, smelling the air, analyzing reports. His brain, freed from the dictates of the body, worked like clockwork. He moved the army to Kerak. Saladin, besieging the fortress, saw dust on the horizon. Scouts reported to him, "A huge army is coming." But the Sultan was not scared by the number of spears. He was told who was leading this army. He was told about the litter. Saladin knew Baldwin. He remembered Montgisard. He knew that this leper shaitan knew no fear. If Baldwin is here, it means the Christians will fight to the last man. It means there will be no easy victory. There will be a bloodbath with an unpredictable outcome. Saladin was a pragmatist. He did not fear Guy de Lusignan. He would have gladly smashed him, but to fight a ghost who refuses to die? That was beyond the rational. And the great Sultan gave an order that many of his emirs found strange. He ordered the siege lifted. Without a general battle, without a river of blood, Saladin simply packed up his machines and left. He retreated before the will of a dying man. This was Baldwin IV's last, greatest victory. Victory of spirit over matter. He lifted the siege of Kerak with his presence alone. Being blind and feeble, he saw a path to victory where the healthy saw only fear. When the army entered Kerak, the jubilation was boundless. The wedding, interrupted by the rockfall, continued with renewed vigor. People praised the king, but Baldwin himself did not celebrate. Lying in his litter, in darkness and pain, he understood the terrible truth. This was the end. He had spent the last resource of his life force. He humiliated Guy de Lusignan, showing everyone his worthlessness. But in doing so, he made a mortal enemy inside his own camp. Guy would never forgive this public disgrace. As soon as the king closes his eyes forever, Lusignan will return. And with him will return chaos and stupidity. Saladin went into the desert, but he was not defeated. He simply stepped into the shadows to wait. He knew the wait would not be long. Baldwin's hourglass was empty. The candle had burned down. The one who held the sky on his shoulders was fading into oblivion, leaving the world to be torn apart by vultures. The march to Kerak became the swan song of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the last flash of light before the onset of a long, hopeless night. The king was carried back into Jerusalem like a holy relic, but even the relics of saints cannot rule a state forever. Death already stood at the head of his bed, and this time Baldwin had no arguments to drive it away. And in the shadows of the palace, Sibylla and Guy were already whispering, preparing for the moment when the king's chest would stop rising. They did not learn the lesson. They thought the crown was an ornament, not a cross. They were wrong, and the price of their mistake would be counted in thousands of lives. The spring of 1185 brought Jerusalem not the blossoming of gardens, but mourning blacker than night. In mid-March, when the desert winds began to subside, so did the breathing of the man who had held the entire Christian East on his shoulders for a decade. Baldwin IV died. He was only 24 years old. Think about it. 24. At this age, modern people are just finishing university. He managed to live a life full of such pain and responsibility that it would be enough for 10 old men. His body, finally defeated by bacteria, turned into ruins, but his spirit remained unbroken until the last second. He died not in the saddle as he dreamed, but in a stuffy royal bedroom surrounded by doctors who could not help and priests who were already dividing his inheritance. With his last breath, a vacuum appeared in the throne room. A terrible, ringing silence. Everyone understood. Not just a monarch had died. The restrainer had died. The only rod holding the state structure together disappeared. The fuse was blown. Before his death, Baldwin made his last strategic move. He desperately tried to save the kingdom from his brother-in-law, Guy de Lusignan, whose cowardice and stupidity he saw right through. The king forced the barons to swear allegiance to his nephew, little Baldwin V. He was a child of 6. The regency was given to Raymond of Tripoli, a smart and cautious politician. It was a perfect plan on paper. Isolate the fool Guy, give power to the wise, and raise a new king. But the plans of the dead mean nothing to the ambitions of the living. The little king, Baldwin V, sat on the throne for a little over a year. In the summer of 1186, the boy suddenly dies in Acre. History is silent about the causes. Was it a disease common in the Middle Ages? Or was the child helped to vacate the spot? We will never know the truth, but the timing of this death was too convenient for the war party. The death of the child was the signal for a coup d'etat. As soon as the coffin with the boy's body was lowered into the crypt, the gates of Jerusalem were closed. The city was cordoned off by people loyal to Princess Sibylla and the Grand Master of the Templars, Gérard de Riedfort. It was a power grab, brazen, cynical, and fast. Raymond of Tripoli, the rightful regent, was pushed aside. Barons who tried to protest saw the glint of Templar swords and prudently fell silent. The coronation ceremony turned into a farce. Patriarch Heraclius, a man whose moral character is better left unmentioned, placed the crown on Sibylla's head. She was the rightful heir by blood, the sister of the leper hero. The barons agreed to her coronation on one condition: she must divorce Guy de Lusignan. "This man is unworthy of the throne," they said. Sibylla agreed. She nodded. She swore she would choose a new husband worthy of defending the Holy Land. And then, standing in the crown before the altar of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in the presence of all the nobility, she committed a betrayal that cost thousands of lives. When the patriarch asked her whom she chose as husband and co-ruler, Sibylla turned to the crowd, found Guy de Lusignan with her eyes, called him to the altar, and, taking the crown from her head, placed it on him. "I choose you, Guy, as my husband and my king." The hall froze. It was checkmate to common sense. Sibylla deceived everyone. She used her blood and her right to put a nobody on the throne. They say that even Guy's own brother, hearing the news, spat and said, "If this fool became king, I could be God himself." Power in Jerusalem was seized by the War Party, a clique of adventurers, fanatics, and careerists. Guy de Lusignan, weak, easily led, vain. Raynald de Châtillon, a bloodthirsty sociopath craving plunder. Gérald de Riedfort, Grand Master of the Templars, whose hatred for Muslims blinded him. Men whom the late Baldwin IV kept on a short leash or in exile now gained absolute power. They got the keys to a car they didn't know how to drive. And in Damascus, in the cool of his gardens, Saladin received news of the coup. Chroniclers do not write whether he smiled or not, but we can assume he breathed a sigh of relief. Saladin was a genius. He respected intellect. He respected Baldwin IV because he was a worthy opponent, a grand master playing with black pieces. But Guy? Raynald? To the Sultan, these were not opponents. They were targets. Saladin realized the main thing. Jerusalem had lost its brain. Only muscles remained, knights, walls, swords. But without strategic leadership, without that iron will that held everything together, these muscles were useless. The kingdom of Jerusalem became like a giant that had been lobotomized. It was still strong, it could still hit, but it could no longer think. The Sultan realized the waiting time was over. God removed the only piece from the board that prevented him from taking Jerusalem. Now, only a pompous French fool in a golden crown stood between him and the sacred city. The air in the Middle East became electrified. It was the calm not before a storm, but before a hurricane. Saladin began sending messengers to all corners of his domains, from the Nile to the Euphrates. The call was simple: get ready. The hour has struck. The enemy has beheaded itself. In Jerusalem, euphoria reigned. The new King Guy distributed lands, threw feasts, and listened to the flattery of courtiers. He enjoyed power, not realizing that this power was a curse. He thought the crown would make him a great commander. He didn't know that the crown would only make his mistakes fatal for everyone. The shadow of the great Baldwin IV melted away. On the walls of Jerusalem, there no longer stood a man in a mask, peering into the desert with unseeing eyes. Standing there were people who were blind not physically, but spiritually. And reckoning was already approaching them. The mechanism of catastrophe was launched, and there was no one to stop it. Peace is not the natural state of humanity. It is just a short smoke break between fights while the fighters wipe off blood and sharpen knives. In the year 1186, the Holy Land was enjoying just such a smoke break. A truce was in effect between Jerusalem and Damascus. Merchants traveled the roads again, carrying spices and silk. Peasants plowed the land without looking fearfully at the horizon. It seemed that after the death of the fierce Baldwin IV and the rise of the weak Guy de Lusignan, the war had paused. Saladin was in no hurry. King Guy was too busy with feasts. This fragile balance suited everyone. Everyone except one man. In the castle of Carac, looming over trade routes like a vulture over carrion, sat Raynald of Châtillon. If Guy de Lusignan was the face of this kingdom's stupidity, then Raynald was its bestial grin. Look at this man. He wasn't a knight in the usual sense. He was a terrorist of the Middle Ages, a robber baron for whom the cross on his cloak was merely a license to kill. He spent 15 years in a pit in Aleppo, a prisoner of Muslims. 15 years in darkness, on bread and water. This time did not humble him. It burned out everything human in him, leaving only hatred and greed. For Raynald, the truce was an insult. But an even greater insult to him was that caravans stuffed with gold passed right under his nose, past his castle, and he couldn't touch them. His fingers itched. His treasury was empty, and a thirst for violence overflowed his soul. In the winter of 1187, the devil tempted Raynald of Châtillon. Or he tempted the devil himself. Scouts reported, "A caravan is moving from Cairo to Damascus." It wasn't just a caravan. It was a river of wealth. Thousands of camels, fabrics, spices, gold, weapons, and people. Rich pilgrims returning from Mecca. The god was weak, as the truce, sealed by the oaths of kings, was in effect. The Muslims trusted the word of the Franks. They thought a king's signature on parchment would protect them better than chainmail. What naivety. Raynald of Châtillon opened the gates of Carac. He didn't bother declaring war. He just went hunting. The attack was fast and bloody. It was a slaughter of the unarmed. Raynald's knights, like wolves, crashed into the column, hacking down merchants and drivers. The sand soaked up the blood, and Carac's treasuries were replenished with enough gold to buy a small European state. But that wasn't enough for Raynald. He took hundreds of prisoners. He shackled them in chains and threw them into dungeons. Amid whispers and screams in eastern bazaars, a terrible rumor began to crawl. They said the sister of Saladin himself was traveling in that caravan. Historians still argue whether this is true, or just a beautiful legend invented to heighten the drama. But for history, the fact is not important. The reaction is. Saladin believed it, or pretended to believe it. In any case, it was the last straw. When the captive Muslims begged Raynald for mercy, reminding him of the truce, he laughed in their faces. "Let your Muhammad come and save you," he threw out. This phrase, passed on by survivors, flew to Damascus faster than an arrow, and it hit the Sultan in the very heart. Saladin, a man famous for his restraint, a man who released garrisons in peace and sent fruit to enemies, fell into a state of cold rage. This was no longer a political confrontation. It was a personal insult. Raynald of Châtillon didn't just break a treaty. He spat into the soul of Islam. In his tent, in the presence of all the emirs, Saladin did something he almost never did. He made a sacred vow. He raised his hand to the sky and swore by Allah that he would personally cut off Raynald of Châtillon's head. Not execute via headsman, not kill in battle, but personally, with his own hand, separate this mad dog's head from his body. In the Islamic world of that time, this was a sentence not subject to appeal. From that moment, Raynald's fate was sealed. It was only a question of time. But first, Saladin tried to act according to the law. He sent envoys to King Guy de Lusignan. The demand was simple and fair. Return the loot, release the prisoners, and punish the bandit. If Baldwin IV sat on the throne, Raynald's head would already be lying in a basket at the envoy's feet, and the caravan would have been returned with apologies. Baldwin understood what state necessity was. He knew when to punish his own so as not to ruin everyone. But Guy sat on the throne. The king summoned Raynald. Imagine the scene: a weak, insecure monarch and a cruel, charismatic killer. Guy asked to return the loot. Raynald merely smirked. "You are king in Jerusalem," he replied, "and I am king in Kerak. I owe nothing to anyone." He told his king to go to hell, and Guy swallowed it. He didn't order the rebels' arrest. He simply threw up his hands before Saladin's envoys. "I can't do anything." This answer became the death sentence for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin realized, there is no one to negotiate with. There is no authority in the West. There is only a bunch of bandits who don't keep their word and don't control each other. The cup of patience overflowed. Diplomats fell silent, giving way to the drums of war. In March 1187, Saladin declared a general jihad. It was not a regular mobilization. It was a call heard by the entire East. From Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, streams of warriors flowed, merging into a mighty river. 12,000 mounted Ghulam knights alone. Tens of thousands of infantry, archers, volunteers thirsting for martyrdom for the faith. It was a Judgment Day army. Saladin emptied his garrisons, leaving cities undefended.
He bet everything. Either he takes Jerusalem now, or never. And in Jerusalem, chaos reigned. Instead of preparing for defense, the barons continued to quarrel. Raymond of Tripoli, the only smart strategist, was declared a traitor for trying to negotiate with Saladin. The Templar Grand Master demanded blood. King Guy rushed between them like a weather vane in the wind. They did not understand the scale of the looming catastrophe. They thought it would be another border conflict. Some looting, then everyone goes home. They were wrong. Saladin was not coming to loot. He was coming to destroy. He was coming to fulfill his oath. One man's rage, multiplied by another man's stupidity, launched a mechanism that would grind the flower of knighthood into dust. The point of no return was passed the moment Raynald of Châtillon opened chests with someone else's gold. Now that gold would have to be paid for with blood. Clouds gathered on the border. The desert wind carried the smell of burning and iron. The time for talk was over. History raised its hammer over the heads of those who forgot that pride is the deadliest of sins. Ahead of them waited Hattin, a place that would become a grave for crusaders and a pedestal for the Sultan. July 1187 began not with a battle, but with a council that became the most expensive suicide in the history of the Middle Ages. In the camp at Sepphoris, where water was plentiful, the leaders of the Christian world gathered. Raymond of Tripoli, the only man in the tent who kept his sanity, begged King Guy de Lusignan to stay put. His logic was flawless. Let Saladin besiege Tiberias. Heat and thirst work for us. If we go to him through the desert, we lose before the first sword stroke. But logic is powerless against testosterone and stupidity. The Templar Grand Master, Gerard de Riedefort, and our old friend Raynald of Châtillon accused Raymond of cowardice. They played on the king's complexes. Are you a man or a coward? This unspoken question hung in the air.
and Guy, led by his wounded ego, gave the order that signed the death warrant for an entire kingdom. We march. On the morning of July 3rd, the army of Jerusalem left the oasis and stepped into hell. 20,000 men, iron-clad knights, infantry in quilted jackets, they walked toward the sun, which kills faster than an arrow in these parts. Saladin did not believe his eyes. Allah had truly deprived his enemies of reason. The Christians voluntarily walked into a trap where there was not a single well. By noon, the march turned into torture. The temperature inside the armor rose to 60 degrees Celsius. Men boiled in their own juices. Water in the wineskins ran out. Tongues swelled so much that warriors couldn't speak. And around them circled Saladin's light cavalry, showering them with arrows, not letting them stop, not letting them rest.
It wasn't a battle. It was a driven hunt. The night passed in a nightmare. The Christians heard the splashing water of Lake Tiberias, which was within reach, but the path to it was blocked by the Sultan's army. They slept clutching weapons, tormented by thirst, knowing that dawn would bring death. On July 4th, 1187, the sun rose over hills known as the Horns of Hattin, and with the sun came fire. Saladin ordered the dry grass and brush to be set on fire. The wind blew in the Christians' faces. Acrid, thick smoke enveloped Guy de Lusignan's army, eating at eyes, clogging lungs. Heat, thirst, smoke, and an endless rain of arrows. Knights, the elite of Europe, maddened by suffering, threw themselves into suicidal attacks just to break through to water. But the wall of Muslim shields was insurmountable. The infantry abandoned the king and ran to the hilltops, where they were slaughtered like cattle. The knights were left alone. In the center of this smoky chaos stood the red royal tent, and next to it towered the true cross, the very one with which the dying Baldwin had won at Montgisard. Now it was in the hands of men who didn't know how to protect it. The finale was swift and humiliating. The royal tent collapsed, the guardian of the cross was killed, and the shrine, the main relic of the Christian world, was in the hands of infidels for the first time in 100 years. For a medieval person, this was worse than death. It meant God had turned away from them. The sky was empty. The battle ended. The trial began. Saladin sat in his tent, triumphant but restrained. The two most important prisoners were brought to him, King Guy de Lusignan and Raynald de Châtillon. Both were covered in dust and soot, their lips cracked from thirst. The Sultan ordered a cup of ice-cold water, sherbet, to be served. He handed it to King Guy. Lusignan drank greedily, and without asking permission, passed the cup to Raynald. Silence, sharper than a scimitar, hung in the tent. Saladin said in an icy voice to the interpreter, "Tell the king, he gave him the drink, not I." By the laws of Eastern hospitality, if you give a prisoner water, you grant him life. Saladin did not intend to grant life to Raynald. The Sultan stood up. He looked into the eyes of the man who robbed caravans, tortured pilgrims, and insulted the Prophet. Saladin drew his saber. One stroke. Raynald of Châtillon's head rolled to the feet of the King of Jerusalem. Guy de Lusignan began to shake, thinking he was next. But Saladin, wiping the blade, uttered a phrase that became legendary. "Kings do not kill kings." But this man crossed all lines. Guy's life was spared so he could witness the shame of his reign. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin approached the walls of Jerusalem. The city was defended by Balian of Ibelin, but it was agony.
Walls could not stand when the army had collapsed. Jerusalem surrendered. 88 years of Christian rule ended. Crosses were torn from domes, bells fell silent, giving way to the calls of muezzins. The golden cross on the dome of the rock was thrown down and dragged through the streets to the hooting of the crowd. Think about the irony of fate. What one dying, half-blind boy held for years by the strength of his spirit, healthy, wealthy, and arrogant men lost in a single day. Baldwin IV sacrificed every piece of his body to save this city. Guy de Lusignan and Raynald de Châtillon sacrificed the city for their pride. Baldwin built the kingdom on will. His heirs destroyed it with stupidity. When the dust of Hattin settled, the world changed forever. The era of the great Crusaders ended. The era of legends and excuses began. Europe would send new armies. Richard the Lionheart would come to fight Saladin. But they would not take Jerusalem back. The city was not lost on the walls. It was lost the moment personal ambitions became more important than the common cause. Saladin won not because he was stronger. He won because his enemies destroyed themselves. God, as it turned out, does not help idiots, even if they have crosses sewn on their cloaks. The story of Baldwin and Saladin is not a fairy tale about good and evil. It is a brutal lesson in management. A system that relies on one genius is doomed, because geniuses die and mediocrities multiply. Look around. Look at modern leaders, at corporations, at empires. Are you sure they are run by new Baldwins? Or is a Guy de Lusignan already lurking somewhere in the shadows, ready to lead everyone into the desert without water, simply because he felt like it? Who holds your Jerusalem today? And what will you do when the water in the wineskins is replaced by sand?